with the invitation.
I've just been hearing.
So do you know?
What's up, Shane?
School. Okay. Wow. What you make now? All free. Where? Northeast. Where's that? In Boston?
That's my schedule.
Congratulations.
There's gonna be one that's in color that's like nice and paved watercolors. Oh, who's it? Yeah. One's
Oh, Josh, you just sent that.
I'm doing well. I have a critter that has died recently. My 5 years. Discovered yesterday, so I've been fortunate that I can go to the lecture hall, which used to be the lower school library, but it is absolutely awful. And they can't find it, you know. They move the ceiling tile, like, no, we don't see anything. Well, you're not going to see it. I pulled all the furniture away. I had 2 bookcases I couldn't move, and they moved them this morning.
I just do not want to do that.
When I find it, I was very cautious, and so and it takes 3 to 4 weeks. So and so today I was in the lecture hall.
Who are you looking for?
Better than
This Steph Nova.
this.
Ignore that.
You should. Yeah, so she can take my defense grade.
Or no, when is Daniel coming home? Summer?
No.
He would.
Yeah, for
He took my position.
So congratulations.
Yes. Yes. He's gonna stay there and work some work.
Yeah. I shot him.
Okay, that's what I was gonna say, thinking, okay, he's in your head and thinking towards the next one.
You're nothing but a number.
Wow.
Oh, what?
No rest for the weary.
You're so good. Like as soon as it's done.
Yeah.
Summer, like for a week.
Josh, let me know about that, about the party, but I think most people are.
It's looking like most people are. I just asked to like the message.
The end of the year is kind of.
Yeah, we did.
Just really came fast.
Yeah, so more people can go to.
It's just really fast.
Oh,
Well, I'm not sure right now. I've always done and I'm just, you know, I hate to plan anything. You're good. No. Always.
Oh, yeah, we're making.
April 2nd. Not COVID the entire time. He was there for 5 days, came home for a couple of days, and then was back for other issues. So, you know, I don't know what you want to do. She did. Her only symptom was she didn't catch her breath. And we checked the whole box, and it was really low. And so I moved within 12 hours.
I'm not gonna stay right here all day long.
And I just, of course,
I like me some music.
I'm just in school in the month of
Like my
April.
fingers are very, yeah, that's weird. But
I'm never,
But your fingers
Sorry,
are
the
here.
person, so it's-
but I'm never,
I
they let me
can
say
honestly
that.
see, but it's so
Miss
nice.
Steph. Yeah, and does Mrs. King come as well?
Yep, she comes to every single
I
one.
thought so.
She is awesome.
The trooper, how are you doing? I'm doing well. I saw Thomas in the hallway. He's grown up so fast. See, junior this year.
Very hard, they send everybody.
Oh, Miss, Steph's here.
You do that, usually I do that during the summer sometimes. Where are yours?
So my oldest is, and also she is a sixth grader. She's at the Lisa Academy, but I think she's transferring to the
It's not you, it's just. I knew you were.
She does her thing.
Good luck.
So, how are you doing?
And so she is running her company.
One of our alums was trying to sign for defense.
It's just not much. It's all
If it has.
No, I'm saying, I have plans.
To its original condition. As best they can. Yeah.
Don't wait.
This is the link that has audio, so you can just tell the camera starts around.
Okay.
like 45 minutes.
Send that to me and then I'll forward it to
Josh, you may have a barcode, I'm just.
She's not in her room.
Does she know that?
The exam might be like this everywhere.
Actually, just like.
So what will Thomas do this summer?
Yeah.
Rolling buses.
Yeah.
Is he going baseball?
So this summer, he's taking.
No.
Oh, yeah. I have two jobs.
And then, I was like, what he went to wrestling tournament. I don't know, so he didn't do this first.
I will learn by
Appealed.
it's not happening.
There you go.
So he's staying on the national wrestling.
Like as an alternate?
Well, he lives in wrestling before time. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So wait, are you right?
Well, if she is, if she's.
That is kind of funny and not.
You need any more?
Wait, let me make sure that they got it.
You know what I like seeing? As soon
I like filling out the front
I like
of
seeing my books up there.
Where are your books?
On her lit review.
Oh, what?
I
Oh,
said when students do their thesis defense, I like seeing my books up in the lit review.
which one is yours?
Food politics.
We didn't read that.
No, but I think, did you borrow it from me?
I borrowed it from the library.
You're supposed to from the library. You could have borrowed it from me. I mean, I think that's public, but I'll.
Wayne Carnahan, wow.
Well, I know you did. You told me about that one.
Okay, all right. Nice save. Yeah, I was gonna say, this is what you.
No, you think
File
at
and say that.
the beginning of the project that came and you like gave me a list of books. That's where it came from.
Welcome everyone to our 11th and final day of the Senior Honors Thesis Defenses. Finishing up with some awesome projects, Caroline and Veronica. And again, it's been a great experience. Love my English department people here. They come to a lot of the defenses, really appreciate that. I know the students appreciate that. And again, it's been a great, and I hope, by the way, audience members, many of you that have been on committees, we are going to have a little gathering at Josh's house on Monday night. And please, food, everything. And if you want to come by and say hello, we're going to have that party, and we'll be sending out the kind of invite about that probably tomorrow morning, as we just changed the date. So anyways, without further ado, speaking of food.
Great segue.
Great segue, absolutely, into Caroline's topic on the Food Network and food culture in America. Let's give it up for Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Toppich, and good afternoon, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the presentation of my senior thesis, Edible Empire, Food Media and Consumerism. I would like to begin with my literature review. Food Media, Celebrity Chefs, and the Politics of Everyday Interference by Sang Rousseau was one of the first books I read beginning this project, and it was useful in opening my eyes to the world of celebrity chefs. This text inspired much of my media chapter with its insight into public celebrities and how they use that status to influence others. Next, Yes Chef, a memoir by Marcus Samuelsson. His novel outlines the struggles of a foreigner making it in the United States in the culinary field, which was not easy. Through his struggles, he discovered that kitchens were one of the least judgmental fields ethnically, and his outreach and blending of cultures helped inspire a large part of the globalization aspect of this project. Finally, Food Politics by Marion Nestle opened my eyes to the corporate side of the food and agriculture industries. Big-name businesses are often run without care of health effects, and this source shows how money cannot solve all problems, and the text aided in developing the economics chapter of this thesis. Julia Child is the starting point of the phenomenon of food media. She was one of the first people to bring cooking to the home after studying in France and eventually writing a cookbook for housewives and others interested in learning the craft of cooking. It is important to note that she had to work hard to get where she was in the culinary world, saying, "Food is an art to be studied, not picked up on the fly." Food was an art form to her, so even though it made her uncomfortable when she was eventually approached to film the first cooking segments on television, she agreed, no matter that she hated being on camera. Julia did a number of segments on Food Network, on a network called WGBH, a Boston news outlet, and she brought elegant French techniques to American kitchens. Needless to say, she became widely popular, as people not only found her incredibly fascinating to watch, but many were inspired by whatever she was making and would use that knowledge to make something of their own. Other news networks soon got the memo that this was something that was going to be extremely profitable, and a spin-off network dubbed Food Network was born. In the early 1990s, Food Network was one of a kind. People were initially very skeptical about having a network that would run 24 hours of cooking. However, the idea quickly became something of a novelty. Being new to the industry, they enlisted the help of Julia Child to figure out how to operate lighting and camera work. The budding network also recruited chefs who were already making it big in the industry and turned them into hosts. That way, no training was needed. All they needed to do was come in and cook. But the network was very broke, so many episodes were shot in one take, and accidents often occurred. In one instance, Mario Battelli grated his knuckles on a cheese grater during one of his shows and had to just plunge his hand into a bowl of water that contained some tomatoes in order to hide the blood seeping from his knuckles. Using a multidisciplinary approach, Food Network began to profit approximately 10 years after its founding, having solidified its hold over American households. My second chapter is looking at the impact of food media on American culture. For the purpose of this thesis, the term culture is defined by anything that is generally understood as part of American life. We begin with a small case study on pumpkin spice. Food has always been a focal point of American gatherings, from Thanksgiving turkeys to Christmas hams, to the smells that we have begun to associate with some seasons. For example, pumpkin spice in the fall. It has been scientifically proven that certain smells trigger a part of your brain that induces a nostalgic feeling. And often the smell of pumpkin spice, a blend of various spices including cinnamon and nutmeg, are associated with the comfort of fall or winter in a child's life. Large corporations prey on this involuntary nostalgia and create a product that is steeped in memory. The real trick is that they only make it available during the fall seasons. So for that short period of time, customers are desperately awaiting the return of the product for a short period of time. So the next season, they are ready to come back for more. In the case of pumpkin spice in the fall, you will see endless ads with pumpkin, cinnamon sticks, and mugs of a warm beverage, allowing your brain to associate these tastes and smells with a particular season. If you look at the graph on the screen, you will notice that the Starbucks pumpkin spice latte launched over the past 3 years. Every year, they notice a large influx of customers in the November-December months. Most recently, they have been moving the launch date up, allowing more time for customers to take advantage of this overpriced spiced coffee. Diversification. America has, in the past, been called a melting pot, but is now generally referred to as a salad bowl. In terms of cuisine, New York is a perfect case study. When you walk down the street of a New York City block, you will see a number of different restaurants that all seem to serve different types of food. And that is a good thing. Every culture has its own specific tastes, preparations, and traditions. Americans tend to believe that we can take those things and make them better, a theory called Americanization, and that turns out to be part of our American food culture. Overall, food can generally define who a certain group of people are deep down. Using their own unique food cultures, people connect with one another and are able to bond over their shared love of certain things. People always say that the ticket to the heart is through the stomach. Americans have a very unique food culture, and we are often known for eating fattening foods like burgers and fries, but chefs like Marcus Samuelsson are trying to change that narrative. Marcus Samuelsson is my next case study for this chapter. Coming up in Harlem, Samuelsson was known for his globalized foods, combining his roots from Africa and Sweden to create a masterpiece of foreign comfort foods. He understood the need for foods that connected people to their cultures, as he had to go looking for the foods that defined him. Americans never really created their own source of ethnic identity, so the possibilities are endless for the types of food one may find on a New York City block. You just have to be willing to look for it. Globalization is a new mixture of cultures into the mainstream culture and the ability of people to find exotic foods in all areas of the world, showing that the global food markets are all connected. Food is something that can be both uniquely personal and very widespread in its audience. American cuisine attempts to bring together all groups of people and create their own sense of home and identity in a new type of food. A good example of this theory is traditional versus American Chinese food. The melting pot theory is very prevalent in this type of cuisine, as Chinese food, as many people know it, was developed by immigrants needing a way to make money after only coming to America with the knowledge of food from their home countries. Economic necessity drove chefs to cook to survive, and America gladly embraced this new cuisine, adding a spin to it as normal, but leaving the core of the food the same. The phenomenon of fast-changing eclectic foods is called the New American Food Movement, and it has blazed a path for globalization directly through the American food scene. A large aspect of food media is the celebrities that people turn on the television to watch. Influencers over the past few years have been extremely engrossed in everyday life without many people even knowing it. People involuntarily change their eating habits based on what they are seeing on the internet or TV. And to make matters worse, the foods that many are switching to because of this influence are highly processed with little nutritional value. Influencers feed off the need of many working Americans not wanting to cook when they get home from a long day of work. So they are encouraged to switch to higher amounts of processed and packaged foods, reducing the amount of fresh foods consumed on a daily basis. Food companies have taken advantage of this working-class American, changing products to make food preparation quick and easy, and often reducing the amount of nutritional value as they go. Obesity rates have risen 36% over the past 20 years. Now, this could be related to the fact that people might not be able to afford the healthier foods with the mass inflation of food that we are having in the country currently, but the food media is not helping this fact. Media has created an edible foodscape for those in the next generation, encouraging a debate on affordable foods rather than fresh ones, which has even begun to trickle down to the next generation. After seeing commercials or advertisements online, children tell their parents what they want, and usually the parents do not question. These foods are typically high in calories and low in nutrition that a growing child needs. These factors all contribute to a rapidly increasing childhood obesity. The significance of food can be seen in the fact that almost every notable holiday is centered around food. Look at Thanksgiving or Christmas or even Easter. Americans used to use food as a way to uphold community values, timing the events with the harvest to celebrate the fruits of that season's labors. But now we need those foods because our holidays would lose a significant amount of integrity of the holiday if we did not follow the customs created years ago. Food is also significant to each culture. Food is intersectional, meaning that while identities overlap, each culture keeps something for themselves. Across the world, every culture seems to eat a different way, whether that is with chopsticks, forks, or fingers. Every culturally small detail is important. Food media allows people to see all of these different cultural qualities, and that can connect people back to something they did not even know was a part of themselves. Having diverse celebrities can also aid in the spread of unique cultures by bringing aspects of those cultures to mass audiences. My third chapter is focusing on the inside of food media. Beginning with Food Network, the main goal of celebrities is to teach or engage viewers in any way possible. Celebrities on Food Network tend to be capitalized and endorsed through commercials and interviews to make the network look better, and they use various strategies to captivate their audience, and one of those techniques is called food porn. The sexualization of food, whether done through visual appeal or actions and sounds by the celebrities, is one of the most effective ways of captivating the audience. Food porn is a concept derived from the sense of longing that can come from seeing someone with a food that you desperately want. Often it is easier for celebrities to sell foods this way when they are larger than life or full of things like sauces and cheeses, things viewers will know would be delicious. They then begin to crave these foods, and while they are typically hard to replicate, they will go out and find unhealthy foods to match these cravings. Food television is not only the foods that we see, but the themes of class, commodity, intimacy, gender, and ethnicity that are steeped into every show. There are typically 5 approaches that Food Network stars use to captivate viewers, with different ones for each type of show. Everything is designed to draw people in and keep them interested, so celebrities often use a gimmick or a hot topic to keep people coming back for more. Many of Food Network shows are reality-based, not even focused on food any longer. So, rather than use the network as an informative tool, people are watching shows for entertainment value and become attached to the hosts on a personal level. Food was romanticized and was even considered to have entered the world of couture. And one of my favorite quotes is describing food as young. It drank, it showed thigh, it even rubbed elbows with the Beatles. But food media was having negative effects on food journalism. Journalism was always able to be more global than that of food media. But even with the progressiveness of many food influencers, journalists are having to move more towards engaging stories rather than the facts. Kids have unique exposure to food media, as we have many forms of social media right at our fingertips. But I'm going to focus on advergaming, which is when food ads are put directly into video games. When kids see unhealthy foods on a platform that they trust, studies have shown that they are more likely to go and consume those higher calorie foods rather than reaching for a healthier snack. This can have negative connotations later in life when those habits are solidified. In the early 1990s, the school lunches were not healthy at all. 45% of children were not meeting their required daily nutrition intake, which has now been shown to have adverse effects later in life. More recently, though, new legislation has allowed American schools to help fight against malnutrition by revamping the concept of school lunches. Here you see a school lunch from the 1990s, no vegetable or fruit in sight. And this is a more current school lunch where kids always have access to at least one vegetable and one fruit at every lunch to help combat childhood malnutrition. Pushing issues through their platforms, like gender bias, is something that celebrities do not often realize they are doing. Shows like Pioneer Woman and Giada at Home are placing women cooking in the home, and they are often just storytellers, people taking care of others rather than the high-stakes competitions that their male counterparts are taking part in seen in shows like Guys Grocery Games or Cutthroat Kitchen. They're showing all their viewers that women should be the picture of domesticity, while men can go out and do what they want, and those stereotypes need to change. This brings me to my next case study, Paula Deen. Paula Deen was known as the queen of butter and comfort foods, and her gimmick on her show was that she was always cooking Southern comfort food for her family. But her reputation was ruined when she was accused and then proven of having used a racial slur to describe how she wanted waiters to look at her brother's wedding. Food Network had to scramble to get in front of the allegations for racial harassment and were quick to cancel all of Deen's appearances and shows. She was pushed out without a thought. The selling point for the network stars is their image, and they were afraid her image would bring down the entire network. Deen tried to make a comeback, but would never be able to fully step foot back in the food industry and would never set foot in a Food Network kitchen again. She almost took down the entire image the network was creating. The women were harmless and just in the home. My final chapter is on economics. Advertisements are one of the main ways that food media makes money, whether from a sponsored Instagram post or the commercials that run during the Food Network shows. The ads that run during Food Network shows are often targeted to the program that was running, and Food Network even releases magazines with various products shown in the shows to get viewers to buy them because they wish to be like their favorite celebrity. Methods of soft selling are also used where a celebrity will mention a product during one of their shows, and without having to lift a finger, sales will boost. But it's not only on television. Domino's, for example, spends $121 million a year on advertising, whether that be for new items or menu items rebranded as something new. It enlists a sense of new to keep patrons coming back. UPFs, or ultra-processed foods, are shown as containing high amounts of processed chemicals and other preservatives. Advertisements are often focused on these foods, hoping to sell things that have long shelf lives rather than focusing on what's good for the consumer. Celebrity chefs are often just used for name or picture in advertisements. Celebrity endorsements are one of the most highly profitable forms of a celebrity ad and have been shown to be incredibly powerful in the market. People are much more likely to buy something they do not know or trust if the face of one of their favorite celebrities is splashed across the front. Some celebrities will take it even a step further and create their own product lines, leaving people to want to buy those products to be just like their favorite celebrities. To conclude, the future of food media is social media. Social media is rapidly growing and changing, and quickly becoming larger than television. More people are exposed to social media on a daily basis than ever before, but it's increasingly difficult for someone to make it in the social media world. To become popular, future influencers have to work incredibly hard to make content that will go viral and then work to stay viral, to stay relevant. It's a harsh world out there. On social media, I have some concerns about the health factors in the industry. 87.3% of the foods posted by celebrities on social media are awarded an MPI score of less healthy, which could negatively affect future generations' eating habits. But some up-and-coming trends are looking promising. This is a picture of the Times pop-up in Boston, and yes, the Times, the magazine. It is a market that they advertised for and then sold tickets to, and while that is highly profitable, it at least is giving the people the opportunity to go see fresh foods sponsored by a credible source. And finally, food delivery services have taken off since COVID. I believe that they can help people branch out to what they're eating and becoming more diverse in their consumption, which will help the overall diversity and globalization trends of America's food industry. Thank you.
Were you able to get into at all the connection between the Food Network and the diet industry? I would think there would be a kind of symbiotic relationship with all of the diet fads and such in the Food Network. Has there been much work done on that? Did you find anything that
there are celebrities that focus on like the quick 30-minute healthy meals and stuff like that. And that's really what they're putting out to be a part of the diet industry. They have shows that cater to almost every food trend that is currently going on, whether it be the big food competitions, food like eating competitions, along with the just like shows like Chopped, which they just give you random ingredients and they have to make something. There's a whole wide range, and there are diet shows.
Would you consider the negative aspects like eating disorders and obesity, or the positive aspects of globalization? Which do you believe is more pronounced?
I believe that in Food Network's case, globalization is more pronounced because they now have so many different travel shows and they bring people from all over to come be on their shows. And they try to stay away from the, obesity allegations that they might be causing health problems in people, but they're trying to combat that, obviously, with saying that, these are reality-based shows and they aren't real life.
I can kind of build on that a little bit. I liked the slides you had with all of the restaurant fronts in New York. And I was thinking kind of in the recent kind of political change we've seen in recent years more towards American nationalism. Like, have you seen, have those ethnic restaurants seeing a decline, or is Food Network like changing the way that they're programming based on kind of like this political change we're seeing?
I would think that Food Network is probably a symbiotic relationship to everything that's happening in the world. While the influencers do have a lot of power, overall the consumer drives everything. We see that in supermarkets, we see that in shows, we see that in trends, we see that in foods that are popular from time to time. Supermarkets have said that when something goes viral on TikTok, they're quick to sell out in stores. So I would think that in New York, especially, I would think the ethnic market is probably doing fantastic because people are interested in a concept I actually didn't get to include in this presentation called culinary tourism, which is a new way that many people, specifically people that are in the later part of their life, they are going places specifically centered around food rather than centered around tourist attractions. So I would think that the ethnic part of New York City is probably doing very well.
Very good job, by the way. I'm a big Food Network watcher, and so your project was very fascinating to me. I'll kind of piggyback on the same thing. You mentioned Americanization, and you touched on how that has been incorporated into the Food Network. And I was also curious about the diversity of the shows that they air. But I was also curious if you came across anything related to age, because I have noticed a trend also where they have cooking shows and competition shows with much younger children that are now being aired. And if you want to touch on that, then I have a second question.
So they have shows they like to say they have shows for every age group, which is why they've brought on the kids shows. It's because they're trying to solidify viewers for like generational viewers. Like there's something for the parents of the kids watching these shows. There's something for the kids because it's something they can relate to. So is that kind of what you were asking?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they've brought on lots of different age groups of shows so that they can cater to each of the age groups and have the largest viewership possible, because that's how the network stays afloat.
Okay. And I guess my second question would be, did you come across any information that the Food Network as an entity was working towards any type of benefits or programs that could help improve the health or the food needs or poverty across the nation?
I know that they've done a few benefit competitions, especially if it's like a really big celebrity that's running it and they're running some sort of, one-time competition. I know they've done some of those that are for benefit, but I did not come across anything that is like a direct correlation to a fund to help with any other outside organizations.
Thank you.
Great job, Caroline. Love listening to your presentation. I have a question, and I know this, and I'm not sure if you just found any of this information in your research or not, but interestingly, the increase in meal delivery subscriptions, like I can't even think of some of the names,
like HelloFresh or
exactly.
Blue Apron.
Was any of that figured in? I mean, did you come across anything about that? Does that seem to still be growing, just like your 24/7 Food Network? It just baffles me that a show can be on all day just based on food. But what about that food delivery subscription? Is that in there at all? Do you think is there a market that's going to continue, or is it something that you think, because tying in with all those food delivery services, meals are so much easier to just get on a day-to-day basis?
I know during COVID, those type of services blew up because people weren't really leaving their homes. They found that they were needing to cook more. That was an easy solution. I don't know how they're still doing, but I would imagine that the demand is still fairly high because people still do need to eat. And if they got into the habit over the couple of years that they might not have been going out as much as normal, I would think the food delivery, those types of services would also be increasing.
So, was there anything that was just totally surprising to you that changed your way of thinking in your research? Like you had a preconceived notion about something, and then after you read about it, did it change your mind? Was there anything? If not, I'd like to know that as well.
There definitely was. I didn't realize quite how much money was in the advertisement business because I didn't realize that advertisements had that much influence over so many aspects of our life.
What you said about Domino's, I was shocked by
Yeah.
that number.
And Domino's, I read a source, it was like Domino's, McDonald's, Burger King, they are spending like hundreds of like millions of dollars every year to advertise so that people will keep coming back to the restaurant. It's not even that they're making new foods, they're literally just taking a food and renaming it. So,
It's a good perspective.
but that was definitely surprising, and I didn't realize how much food media had affected our American culture.
Thank you.
Fantastic job. I saw, I was like, I'm not like a big social media person, but I saw Tabitha Brown up there who I kind of like a lot. And so then I was like, well, I do know an influencer. Do any of the influencers who push some of these foods, do they have any of them lost? I mean, Tabitha Brown's like, she has her brand, like she knows her voice, her thing. But do any of them lose credibility by pushing some of these, cheaply processed foods that really are kind of crappy?
Yes, so that is always a danger to any sort of journalist, influencer, network host. If they are backing the wrong products, consumers will definitely reply to that. For example, I had Alton Brown on one of my slides. I don't know how many people are familiar with him. He was really big in Food Network's early days, and he was all about the science behind the food. So he has done shows for years. He's still relevant, but he recently, over quarantine, started doing things like YouTube and Instagram, and he recently started doing a few ad deals on Instagram, and he got a lot of backlash. So people are quick to jump once you have that, set viewership. People are quick to jump at any changes, but if it comes up on those, products that aren't as good, people are expecting that, and there won't be as big of a backlash.
Excellent job.
Questions from the audience?
Maya?
Do you think that, like, with the rise of social media, soon, like, television will become obsolete in the shaping of food culture?
I think it's possible, but I think we have a long way to go before then. A new platform would need to come up, because I don't think, while television, yes, is still doing very well, social media is starting to, and social media, I think, is just at like the bottom level right now. I think it still has so much further to go, just because it's so readily available to such a wide amount of people. So I think right now focusing on social media is where the food industry is going to be, and I think they're probably going to be transitioning the style of journalism that's also associated with it. Question, Josh?
So this is like kind of related to Maya's question, but like a lot of kids I know would rather watch somebody like Nikado Avocado on YouTube too. Like he's a mukbanger, right?
Yeah.
And he just like eats a lot of junk food. And that will get like millions and millions of views, like hundreds of millions of views as opposed to like a Food Network channel.
Yeah.
So what does that suggest to you about like American culture, that like that's more popular? And even the fact that we have like entire networks like dedicated.
Well, for one, people like Nikado Avocado, I'm pretty sure people only watch him because they like really hate him because he's so controversial.
Oh gosh.
But I think people like it, one, shorter, no commercials, and they can search for what they want at that specific time, where on television it has to be what happens to be playing at that time. So yeah, I think it's just like people would just rather watch something that they get to choose at that moment in time. Mr. Keels?
I was wondering if you noticed any trends, or if you came across anything of interest or disinterest in the culinary arts as like a field of study in correlation with this food media.
So I'm actually going to college to study food science, which isn't exactly food media, but it has aspects. Food science is like the, how things work. Why does bread rise? That kind of thing. So I think that there is some correlation. You need to have the food scientists behind the media influencers, because the influencers have to, on some level, need to know about the food they're talking about. Otherwise, audiences will think they're fake or don't know what they're talking about, or they won't be captivating. They need to have that level of knowledge. So I think there is a correlation behind culinary arts, because also culinary arts goes back to how the food looks, and it has to look nice to make it on any sort of platform. Mr. Will.
Thanks. Great presentation. Food deserts and the types of advertising that are targeted towards food deserts, or just my terminology is possibly gonna be outdated, but economically disadvantaged areas. Did you find anything about that? And I have sort of a follow-up, because you just mentioned it. How important in these types of areas is education? Talking about school lunches and just the types of food that's eaten at home. If you're going to pull any of those threads that I just sort of threw out there.
So in food deserts, there are areas that are typically, don't have access to the, daily fresh fruit and vegetables. So in those areas, it is those highly processed foods, those UPFs, that are really pushed to those areas. They're cheap, they have a long shelf life, but they're not very good for you, which is causing that high level of malnutrition in children and high levels of obesity rates both in children and adults. And the second part of your question was
food education. Community education around food.
So people need to know what they're eating so that they can properly fuel their bodies. I'm a strong believer in that. I'm an athlete, so I've had to for a long time know what I can and can't eat before I go work out or go race. And I think that's important, so that if you know how to fuel your body, you can more actively take steps towards that. Even if you are in a food desert, look for those foods that might be slightly better for you, have less chemicals, etc. Maybe.
So as somebody who consumes food media, especially watches these TV shows that you're talking about, has writing your thesis changed how you watch these shows?
Yes, because I now can see that a lot of it is fake and staged, and it is all reality based, which a lot of us already know, but we choose to ignore. You can't really recreate the things that they're showing you on the shows, and there are some that will publish recipes, but a lot of people will end up finding those recipes are not quite as good when you reproduce them as they might have looked on TV. So you have to take everything from Food Network and those types of shows with a grain of salt, because that stuff is all for entertainment.
Good pun, by the way.
Audio.
So with apps like Uber Eats and DoorDash and things, they increase the price by a lot. Let's say $20 for a $6 meal. Do you think that hinders people from trying newer, healthier foods or more expensive foods because they know that if they order it through this app, they're going to have to pay much more than what they would if they actually download it?
I wouldn't think so. I think if you're committed to using the app to order food, you're not going to particularly care about the extra cost. It could definitely provide a hindrance. It also it makes it less available to that wider range of audiences, because you do have to pay, an obscene amount of money for a very small amount of food. But I think that if you are really going for it, having all of those options at your fingertips, people are more likely to choose things that maybe they aren't 100% comfortable with, or, this new place just opened, I'm just gonna, get it because it's easy and convenient. So at least that's what I'm hoping for the future. Okay. Maya?
I guess as we're going into college and how we're probably going to have less access to fresh food because we'll be having to take care of ourselves short on time, and mom won't be there to help cook. How would you navigate the foodscape as you kind of become busier and have less access to places where you can get fresh food?
Well, depending on where you go to college, you should have a dining hall very close to where you're living, especially as a freshman. But you just have to choose to make those decisions for those healthier foods that you might eat at home. There's also, the fun freshman 15 that everybody talks about, where you go crazy your freshman year and then learn. So the good thing about that is, I think even if you're busy, you're going to be hungry. You're going to want to go eat. There's going to be food available. You're just going to have to consciously make those decisions. And that's a big part of education. You need to know what's good for your body, what's not good for your body, how to eat, portion sizes, don't eat in excess, that type of thing. Okay.
up here, and then family after committee. So King, you're gonna be the photographer again, as always. Okay, so we want to keep this the way Angela's been doing it, so Caroline, come over here. We'll put the committee, and then, so the way we get to see. Okay. All right, Angela, we ready?
We are right up here at E1.
All right, family.
Great job. And you got it just like tonight. Great job.
I know you said foodie. When I saw the list, I was like, I'm gonna hate it up with that. I am not gonna be making her 2 different meals.
Caroline.
Aw, always. Sorry, Mom. I got one first.
Oh my God. You probably, I'd say, right side, Miss King. All right.
Alright, I'm gonna take one horizontal and vertical. One. That's okay. 1, 2.
Good job. Thank you.
Great job.
You did a great All right.
All friends.
Okay. We have audience, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes.
Girl.
I tell you.
Here we go.
I'll park it here.
Yeah, where are you in the car? You guys are nice to make comments.
Okay.
Or not.
Maybe I forgot to get it today.
I think you ever
Oh my gosh.
Yes, you know, many years ago, you told me about I was reading those papers out loud to each other. And like, I guess over like COVID, online, everything had kind of fell by the wayside. And then I just had shower thoughts. I was like, you know what? What was that? And so then we started going out, and like, I mean, it was fantastic. And so we're gonna do it again tomorrow. And that I'm reading out loud, like actually being conscious of the word that you're reading. Yeah.
A lot of times for the clarity in the writing has been a major problem.
Yeah.
Is there a third committee member?
I think it's just you and me. I do have a minute.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Look, I have a present for you. Goals, and they have to come up with a solution and talk about like the different aspects within them for the countries that need them. Yes, I can share some with you, but also we did,
They did those on Canva.
yes,
Not. I'm pushing Canva. I'm pushing Canva more and more. It's so good. It's so
now that
easy.
I can make like stuff on there, I'm like, this is actually really nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's more user friendly for like HP and
I'm gonna text Sarah Gorman. She's always getting pulled into meetings or something.
yes,
but,
and it's the end of the year too, so I'm sure she's busy.
Josh, which one is it?
What?
Which app is it?
Oh, Chromium.
Yeah.
Where?
First page.
It's on the first.
middle.
Oh, there it is. Oh, that one's your own.
Yeah.
I think.
I'm a Amoeba as well. My spread is quite far. It's like man spreading, but it's worse.
Yeah.
Because mine's not just my legs. It's my stuff. to my own notes.
We're gonna see, I'm trying to read this one, so I'm gonna got all text and scores also. See if we can reach her. Does the word count on this?
I want to say 51,300 words.
Set it down lightly or it might
Yeah.
break the table.
Oh, no, she didn't. Oh, okay, she did. Ms. Gorman's on her way. Wow, it's been a great year. Senior Honors Thesis Defenses. This is 22nd defense. And yeah, welcome everyone. We're going to wait on Ms. Gorman. She's on her way up. So, Josh, what do you think? Thumbs up, thumbs down overall?
Senior thesis.
Thesis, what do you think?
Double thumbs up.
Miriam, I'll ask you. Sarah,
Very,
what's your thoughts? You got your topic already picked?
Wayne's roll.
Oh my God. Better not be about the subversion of the U.S. government by the CIA. Gonna be on some sort of list for some of the work you've been doing. So. I loved your Southern African presentation the other day.
Thank you.
Nicely done. Who else do we have out here? Fatima, if you could ever get off your phone long enough, maybe you can actually write a thesis next year. Don't get sassy with me. Maylee, how are you? Thumbs up? Again, committee members, some of you trickled in. Of course, we got our party. We've moved it to Monday, 6 o'clock at the Diaz Mansion, is it?
Yes.
Shack.
So we will be doing that on Monday. That way we won't conflict with the event on Tuesday. So you guys are Tuesday.
Thank you, sir.
That's awesome. Gorman, what are you? She's worth the wait, right, Sarah Gorman? Just ask her. She's worth the wait. So, Angela, you doing okay?
I'm doing great.
Galen, never again I ever want to see white socks and sandals. Okay. Got another year together. I don't ever want to see that again.
All the kids are wearing.
No, don't tell me that.
They wear their Birkenstocks with
Oh,
their
please.
white Nike socks.
Just a little bit of background on this project. It's the longest project in the history of the thesis project. It started in 2003, so at 51,000 words, 175 pages of text. So it's a beast.
How much was done in the last month?
She wasn't in school a lot the last month. She has to work on thesis. Can't be in your class. Is that priority? How much did you write after spring break?
After spring break?
Yeah.
The entirety of my concluding chapter, and that was around 10 pages. The majority of my fourth chapter, that was right at 25 pages. And then a few sections were developed within my third chapter, I believe. So all in all, probably around 40 pages-ish were written within the month of April. That's a lot.
How many citations did you have, Mary?
I'm not sure.
That didn't work. She has 517, so anyway. I want to thank Rachel Prim, who especially, she came on late to the committee and filled in admirably.
No, wait, no.
No.
On this one I was.
No,
I'm
oh.
an original.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm an original.
okay, you're
And yeah.
Got you.
Yes, I got. I
That's okay.
added these.
It's been a long 2.5
Yeah,
weeks.
it's all right.
Thank
Sorry.
you, Ms. Gorman. You're worth the wait.
I came
I
straight
felt
from
that.
another meeting. I am so
You are
sorry.
worth the wait. Okay, without further ado, let's give it up for Veronica.
Good afternoon. I'm Veronica Roden. I'm presenting my honors senior thesis titled My Womanhood Wrapped in Chains, The Psychocultural Effects of Black Womanhood in Bondage. Extensive research was conducted over the course of this project. Here, the most beneficial sources have been highlighted. Reza Aslan, renowned theological scholar's book, God, A Human History of Religion, completely altered my approach to my 4th chapter, May My God Let Me Free. Aslan's historical analysis of religion as a man-made construct caused me to shift the secondary focal point of my thesis to better align with the thematic nature of the thesis. Similarly, the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion was a great support for my 4th chapter with an abundance of material focusing explicitly on the intersection of women and religion, particularly their published works by Cheryl Townsend Gilkes. As one of the primary lenses of the project was psychological, the American Psychological Association were particularly helpful. The fields of historical and Black American psychology are notoriously underdeveloped, so the APA provided me with the necessary understanding and factual backing in the formulation of my analysis, especially in my 2nd chapter, My Body Is Not My Own, where psychology plays a prominent role in the discussion of the impact of sexual exploitation on enslaved women. I cited numerous works published in the Journal of African American History throughout 4 of my 5 chapters. It was the most broadly utilized of the sources included here. Enslaved Women in America was the first source procured for this project back in September, and it provided me a valuable foundational knowledge of various aspects of life for enslaved women and directed me towards other sources that would further develop my understanding of the specific areas my research focuses on. Reflections on the Black woman's role in the community of slaves is a journal article by Angela Davis, and it was formative in the conceptualization of crucial sections of my 1st chapter, 350 Years a Slave, where I set up the necessary historical context of the project and the development of Black women's experience in slavery from its inception. Black Girls in Critical Media Literacy for Social Activism by Cheryl A. MacArthur played a defining role in the direction of my 5th and concluding chapter, Rewriting the Tale of Our Distress, with a plethora of pathways different from that which I settled on being more popular for this specific avenue of academic and social literature. Reading this article and placing more value in childhood development and critical media literacy made me ultimately decide to focus on dismantling harmful systems generationally from the bottom up instead of the reverse. Finally, the Slave Narrative Federal Writers Project conducted in the 20th century was vital to my beginning to understand the experiences of enslaved peoples from the perspective of enslaved peoples. One of the primary purposes of this project was to humanize, attempt to give agency back to, and attempt to give voice to a degraded and dismissed group of people whose voices have often been ignored in scholarly work. So the slave narratives, along with other primary accounts cited throughout the thesis, were the most important pieces of literature that I analyzed. The 6 overarching topics that will be discussed are the fundamentals of exploitation, in which I will expand upon the theoretical frameworks and societal structures that are foundational to the thesis, sexual exploitation under slavery, religious development and subjugation of Black Americans, the evolutionary effects of sexual exploitation, which covers the period from Reconstruction to the 20th century, the contemporary impact of sexual and religious exploitation on Black women, and finally, Rewriting the Tale of Our Distress, which covers the solution I put forth towards eradicating the structural issues that have begun a legacy of centuries of exploitation. The central pillar of the thesis is the existence of the American social hierarchy of white male hegemony. Those with crucial identities occupy one or more identities which displace them in society, such as race or sex. Those that possess single-axis crucial identities occupy the second tier of the hierarchy, and they possess one of the features of normality, whereas those on the bottom tier who possess multiple crucial identities exist as lowest tier and are also considered the outlier. This theory in the context of the project would see white men occupy the highest tier, followed by white women for their whiteness and Black men for their manhood, with Black women who possess none of the features of none of the identifying features of normality placed at the bottom. This is based on Audre Lorde's theory of intersectionality, which argues that different aspects of our identity, such as race, sex, class, religion, gender, socioeconomic status, among others, all factor into the existence of an individual's singular identity and therefore impact their societal positioning and circumstances. The higher your social positioning and the more privilege and defendability you possess. Discussion around consent and the ethics of consent have become more commonplace in recent years and as our general society slowly moves out of an era of silence. Today, as we analyze the sexual abuse of enslaved women, it is important to remember that modern convictions of ethics still hold. Of the network of theoretical explanations depicted here, beginning with the overall theoretical consent, going to rights-based argument, the harm explanation, serious sexual harms, the consent explanation, only the consent explanation, a theory by Tom Doherty, can adequately apply to enslaved women. The theory states that the wrongness of unwilling sex violates the basis of consent, thereby including enslaved women because it does not rely on ownership of oneself, nor proof of harm. The larger claim that I make off of this is that even if these modern theoretical requirements have been fulfilled, it does not mean that the relationship is consensual. Slave-master relationships are not and can never be considered consensual nor romantic in nature because of the inherent power imbalance that exists. Exercising this power imbalance is one of the reasons behind the pathology of rape. Rape is not about sex. Sexual satisfaction is not the primary motivation nor goal behind rape. Rape is an act of violence meant to dominate, degrade, and exert power over another by violating them sexually at a point of key vulnerability. Its traumatic nature is heightened by the implications of surviving assault in a patriarchal and misogynistic society. Rape and other forms of sexual violence against enslaved women were incredibly common during this time period because they reinforced the social hierarchy through the humiliation in inflicting such violence against a subjugated group of people and the lack of repercussion for these actions. The biggest enabler of these social customs was the American legal system. Two cases, Tennessee versus James Keaton in 1855 and Commonwealth versus Ned in 1859, illustrate the ways in which the American legal system permitted and upheld sexual violence against enslaved women, even in cases in which pedophilia or violence against children was present. The Keaton case specifically cites Section 15 of an 1829 legal code, which specifically states, quote, "If any slave or free person of color shall be guilty of the crime of rape upon the person of any white female child under the age of 10 years, he shall suffer death for such offense upon conviction," end quote. This distinction is why the case was allowed to go to trial, but because of Keaton's whiteness and the victim's lack thereof, he was found not guilty. In Commonwealth versus Ned, the case included the rape of two little girls, one black and one white, and the rapist was an enslaved groundskeeper. No federal codification would come expressly prohibiting the rape of black women or enslaved women until 1863, when Section 2, Article 44 of General Order No. 100 was released. The transatlantic slave trade facilitated the initial forced migration from Africa to the Americas. On these journeys, the African women would be voyeuristically sexually violated and forced to commit humiliating or degrading acts for the crew and captain's amusement at the peril of their or their children's lives. This is the beginning of black women's exploitation in the United States. Despite receiving the smallest proportion of enslaved people in the international trade, the United States would have an enslaved population which amounts to 13% of the total population by 1860, largely because of the fertility and pregnancy patterns of enslaved women. Over time, the vast majority of enslaved peoples would no longer be forced immigrants from Africa, but were increasingly victims of the domestic slave trade. A subsidiary of the domestic slave trade was the fancy girl trade. The fancy girl trade was the sexual commodification or sex trafficking of enslaved women, typically very young, between the ages of 9 and 18, light-skinned with loose hair. The historical implication that sexual abuse occurred most frequently between light-skinned slaves and their masters can be partially attributed to the existence of this institution. More often than not, these fancy girls, such as Louisa Piquette, who is depicted here, are born into a cycle of continuous sexual abuse and a system similar to our modern legacy prostitution, with each generation getting farther away from the coloration of their progenitor or foremother, resulting in these often very fair-skinned black girls who lack the physical capabilities to do field work, essentially being inadvertently bred to be victims. This proximity to whiteness carries complicated historical implications, but these women most often end up in a system known as concubinage. Concubinage is a long-standing practice seen in many societies, though it's most commonly associated with the kept mistresses of royal or aristocratic men. While the dynamics of these relationships are typically very uneven because of the significant power and influence of the man compared to the woman, it was grotesquely so in the case of American slavery. Perhaps one of the most famous black women in American history, and certainly the most famous concubine, Sally Hemings is an excellent example of this. For much of history, the academic discourse surrounding her life, existence, and relationship to Thomas Jefferson was wildly contested for the smear on Jefferson's legacy it represented, until a DNA study done by Eugene Foster proving indisputably that her children were fathered by him. Popular depictions of her favor either the romanticization of her and Jefferson's relationship or describe her cunning for her negotiation of her children's freedom, thus whitewashing the reality of her situation. Thomas Jefferson was her owner and her legitimate half-sister's husband. Presumably, their sexual relationship began in France after she accompanied his daughter, who she would remain friends with until the end of her life, on her journey. At the time, she was only 14 years old. When Jefferson asked her return with him to Monticello, despite her having technical freedom while in France. She made the decision she is most often remembered for to negotiate freedom for her children. Here, I challenge the traditional narrative surrounding her memory. Sally Hemings was a victim and a child. Jefferson owned her entire family. She was employed by his estate in France, so his departure would mandate her quickly find new employment in an unfamiliar country. And there is a likelihood that she was already pregnant at the time. She made a pragmatic decision, and Jefferson, like many men of his position and circumstances, took full advantage of this and did not recognize paternity of his children with her, nor ensure the literacy of Sally and her children. He only somewhat fulfilled his promise to her, their children being freed not on their 21st birthdays as per their agreement, but by his death. We know little of Sally's character, views, or perspective, besides basic biographical details recounted by her son Madison Hemings, or included in official documents and newspapers. She was illiterate, and thus left no personal records. This is one of the most famous Black women in American history, and she is entirely voiceless. Pregnancy and medical treatment was notoriously invasive and exploitative for enslaved women. They were often used as test subjects and treated very inhumanely by their doctors, who were at this time exploring and expanding the field of gynecology. James Marion Sims, regarded as the father of gynecology, built his success and legacy off the suffering of enslaved women. Today, a monument has been erected honoring the mothers of gynecology, Black women that were killed in Sims' egotism and hunger for medical acclaim. One aspect of the abuse that Black women faced that is often ignored is the role of white women in upholding the racial hierarchy. While this is a trend that has continued modernly, under enslavement, white women played an active role in the ownership and torture of enslaved peoples. White women have historically leveraged their second-tier social positioning to exercise persuasion-based social or soft power. Some women resented the non-consensual sexual relationships present between enslaved women and the masters, and acted out of rage and envy. Although while this depiction is accurate, over-reliance on it discounts the overall role white women played in the day-to-day maintenance of slavery. There were some who were capable of exceptional cruelty, such as the infamous Madame Delphine Lalaurie. White women's participation in upholding slavery was vital to its perpetration. Moving into religious development and subjugation, religion has evolved to play a significant role in the subjugation of Black women and the larger Black community, but this is partially rooted in the idea of the humanized God. The humanized God is a term coined by Reza Aslan to describe the phenomenon that occurs with human religion, where we alter our defined figures to resemble us. With the Aryanization of Christ, symbols of Christianity have become visually associated with whiteness. In believing themselves to have proximity to God, the religious imagery, and then the spreading of the doctrine of Christianity to enslaved peoples through the wave of proselytization in the 18th century, Black Americans adopted a similar perspective. By weaponizing Christianity, they were successful in creating internal division amongst Black Americans by rooting ideas of self-hatred and demonization of ancestral practices. But discussion of the doctrine itself actually played a counterproductive role because of Black Americans' spiritual attachment to freedom narratives, otherwise known as liberation theology. Traditional African religions merge in a form of religious syncretism due to the difficulty to maintain them with a diversity of tribal, regional, and kingdom origin, and the hedonistic portrayal of them in the Christian faith. They persist today in the form of voodoo, particularly in the case of Louisiana and the Carolinas, and more predominantly hoodoo, which evolved out of conjure. The conclusion of slavery did not mark the end of sexual exploitation or societal degradation of Black women. Throughout the latter half of the 19th and 20th century, Black women continued to face trials, sexual attacks, legal and social discrimination, and their public and their communities remained ignorant to their suffering. The prevalence of stereotype played a significant role in their continued exploitation. The three most widely known and arguably impactful stereotypes were the Mammy, the Jezebel, and the Sapphire. Historical images become the roadmaps for our society. The most notable example of this is the Mammy stereotype in relation to the Aunt Jemima pancake controversy that occurred in 2020. The impact of these stereotypes on Black women's social psychological development in American society cannot be understated. In a study done by Adams Bass, Stevenson, and Bentley Edwards, researchers found that groups of Black youth tended to attribute blame and accountability on famous Black women for their sexualized media depictions and drew parallels between said imagery and their societal treatment, but attributed blame solely to the overall society and producers in intentional or clear depictions of the modern mammy. Stereotypes create sexual and societal scripts for Black women, which removes the comfort of navigating life and sets up all interactions and behavior as defense against stereotype. Patriarchy, specifically the Black patriarchy, has partial culpability for Black women's lack of social progress. It is key to first understand that prototypical models of patriarchy cannot be applied to Black American culture or Black American communities. As a byproduct of slavery, racial discrimination, structural lack of advancement, and the economic demands of capitalism, an egalitarian labor structure has historically persisted within Black households, as the family often needs multiple streams of income. Despite this, as a form of survival, many Black women focus more on the more immediately threatening issues such as mob lynching and place Black female-specific issues such as equal treatment, sexual violence, and harassment in the workplace to be dealt with afterwards, to their later detriment. In each resurgence of Black power movements, a twofold demand rises: Black power, but also Black patriarchy. In this situation, power is seen perceptually equivalent to assimilation to whiteness. For this reason, Black women are often neglected and ignored in the struggle for equality by Black men who seek partnership and companionship with their second-tier power relation, white women. Both of these groups with the single-axis identity receive the support and participation of Black women who are members of both groups, but lack adequate change for Black female-specific issues. This has caused Black women historically to advocate for themselves by themselves, though it often comes at the cost of community disagreement or appropriation. #MeToo movement founder Tarana Burke had been using this phrase and hashtag since 2006 to communicate with and bring awareness to Black and brown girls and women who experience sexual violence. It was popularized in the mid-2010s amidst the Harvey Weinstein allegations and has since had tremendous cultural impact. Burke recognizes this and is greatly appreciative of the dedication to the cause, but speaks of the neglect of Black women prior to the allegations and the continued silencing of women of color's voices throughout and in the aftermath of the movement, stating, quote, "We are socialized to respond to the vulnerability of white women, and it's a truth that is hard for some people to look in the face. There's a stark difference in what it takes to get attention around Black women and girls." Burke sought to highlight an incredibly important point: the sexualization, or rather, rampant victimization of Black girls. Currently in the United States, 1 in 4 Black girls will be sexually abused before age 18. And 40 to 60% of Black women report being subjected to coercive sexual contact by 18. This is as much of a cultural issue as a societal one. There is a culture of silence around assault of Black women and a deeply rooted culture of victim blaming in overall American society, but especially within Black American communities. This was seen in the popular terminology of fast, otherwise known as fast-tailed girls, a derogatory phrase used to morally insult and imply that they are asking for assault. This is a symptom of the larger issue of adultification of Black girls. Adultification of Black children is a major societal problem and contributes to the disparities of juvenile crime, education, and disciplinary action. As ideas of childhood expanded in the 20th century, they did not include Black children, particularly Black girls. Sexual scripts and stereotypes are placed upon Black girls at extraordinarily early ages, thus confusing Black womanhood and Black girlhood and making them interchangeable to many. One of the most important components of childhood is innocence. By stripping Black girls of their childhood, they are inherently seen as less innocent and more guilty. In this graph, you see adultification scores tested on a mostly white audience of adults, in which they identified the magnitude of certain age criteria developments seen at each age group 1, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, white girls as compared to Black girls, and their knowledge of certain sexual acts, of their knowledge of violence, and their involvement in certain activities. This is based off of perception and not reality. As a result of the oppression that Black women continue to face modernly, especially in religious circles, they have once again sought alternative belief systems that may provide them liberation. A sociological trend has emerged of Black women leaving Christianity for witchcraft and other traditional forms of indigenous religion. The graph seen on screen is from the Pew Research Center. It's based off an article written about the religiosity of Black Americans as compared to other ethnic and racial groups within the United States. And here you see that 83% of Blacks say that they believe in God with absolute certainty, 75% say that religion is important, 73% say that they pray daily, and 47% say that they attend religious services at least once a week. This was a big component of my 4th chapter that regarded religion, as the recent sociological trend of Black women leaving the faith is a trend that has currently dumbfounded many scholars and researchers because of the abnormality of Black Americans leaving Christianity, the religion. There are many different avenues that have been presented and taken to challenge the structural issues that make exploitation and abuse of Black women fairly easy in America. One of the most obvious solutions is racial socialization. Despite legal segregation ending in the 1960s, communities remain incredibly racially segregated, especially white American communities, which have the highest rates of racial segregation in the US. At its core, America has an empathy problem. We have been in an empathy pandemic since our inception. American society is incredibly individualistic, which means that people often prioritize the preservation of their privilege afforded from their social positioning at the cost of others. The lack of racial socialization means that for most of their lives, many white Americans live in insulated areas. According to Gerbner's cultivation theory, which is seen here on the screen in a flowchart graph to better explain it, repeated exposure to certain images in media combined with lack of socialization to certain things and groups leads to ideas manifesting as social reality. This causes stereotypical images to become truth in the minds of those who lack the socialization to counter the imagery of the media. The lack of media literacy increases in its problematic nature as we continue to modernize because of exposure to certain themes and ideas. Introducing critical media literacy to children, particularly Black American girls, is crucial for the formation of their self-esteem and identity. It prevents the internalization of these negative stereotypes and ideas and allows Black girls the opportunity to flourish in their personal honesty without living their life in defense against societal scripts. As we move forward, it is our responsibility to question our unconscious bias and ensure that more scholarly focus is being placed on Black American women. In centering Black American women in research and instilling empathy in our society, we can ensure agency and safety for future generations of Black women and girls. Thank you.
So, I've got so many questions. You mentioned culture with the sexualization issue. How much of it is cultural versus economics? Is economics not the driving force behind this, or is it just being consumed by the fact that the cultural narrative has already been in place?
I will ask you to clarify, are you talking about the egalitarian labor system?
I was talking about later when you were talking about the sexual exploitation issue, and so more into the contemporary area.
So the thesis was designed thematically to go from the beginning of slavery with the white supremacy being the sole problem to the contemporary age where we are dealing with internal issues within the Black community. And so that's where you see the root of our problems today. As soon as problems can be internalized, they are weaponized to a much greater extent. When communities turn in on themselves, it creates a cycle that is near inescapable. And so the cultural component that we see today is driven somewhat by economics. Many scholars have argued that the conservative attitudes that Black men possess towards Black women is driven by a socio-psychological need to compensate for their lack of economic success historically in the country and their personal lives. It's seen as a form of control. I somewhat disagree with this argument within my thesis, though I see the merits of it. I believe that a large part of it is just due to the formation of Black culture as a ethnic group and a culture within the context of a patriarchal white supremacist nation. Contrary to other traditionally considered Black ethnic groups that developed post-colonization, Black Americans developed in not a pocket, not as a subsidiary, but as a part of an overall culture, and because of the racial and historical link, rooted and connected themselves together. And so because of this, we have adopted many of the same aspects of that original white supremacist, slave-based patriarchal culture, and that's become very deeply rooted in Black American culture. And the graph that I showed previously, and a large part of my fourth chapter deals with the religiosity of Black Americans, which compared to other ethnic groups and racial groups within the United States is much, much stronger historically and presently than other racial groups. And so having that religious component, and with Black Americans' historical deep-rooted attachment to religion. Many of those patriarchal ideas, many of those misogynistic ideas have come with it. And so Black men sort of compensate for their lack of economic and social progress within this country by turning their backs on not necessarily Blackness itself, but by shunning Black women. And that's something that you've seen really commonly as interracial relationships have become more of a common topic of discussion.
Mine's not as intellectual. What about the influencers today, like Megan Thee Stallion and Lizzo, who are trying to speak up and get popularized, get the women's voice out there? Like, do you see this as just playing into the objectification of women, or is this trying to own their own narrative?
And so I think that's actually a really important point that I kind of touch on in the third chapter, in which Black women have been left out of feminist movements, out of free sexuality movements so often historically, that now as we move into this modern age, even though we have women trying to reclaim their bodies and reclaim these narratives, it's several decades too late. And so now that we're finally discussing the sexualization of Black women in the media, we have these women trying to counter these narratives and have agency of their bodies. And I truly believe that that's a good thing, and that societally we are seeing such great progress in Black women's self-esteem for it. But I don't believe that that's going to be embraced by scholars. I don't believe that's going to be embraced by the media, largely just because Black women taking agency of themselves and their bodies has been so discouraged for so long that even though we are seeing a positive renaissance of Black American sexuality and Black women's bodies, we're not going to see that embraced by the larger scholarly community.
I was wondering if the war on drugs had a major impact on, or if you even researched the possibility of the war on drugs having a major impact on Black females and their communities in regards to the sexualization of Black females, and especially with younger females as well.
So that actually covers research that I had done for this project and a paper that I wrote last year on a more contemporary topic. So the war on drugs played a really fascinating role in the development of the Black family unit moving from the 80s and the 70s. And there was a fad, so to speak, of research, a scholarly focus done on the Black family unit in the 70s and the 80s. And that's largely because of the influence of the war on drugs. My core argument states that Black American families are matriarchal, which is very controversial. And so the influence that the war on drugs played on the Black American family unit, in my opinion, is that we were already a very matriarchal community. We were already a very matriarchal society. I would go so far as to argue that, considering that children are usually regarded as the building blocks of life, that most societies are matrifocal. But the matriarchal nature of Black American communities meant that the war on drugs exacerbated the economic issues that were already seen in Black American households, and definitely, I would say, exacerbated the issues of division in Black families and Black family units. There's a lot of focus placed on the Black nuclear family. Because of the patriarchal roots of that, I often dismiss the notion, but there is some value to the idea of a systemic societal legal issue having deep hands in the Black community and orchestrating the destruction of families.
Kudos, wonderful job. I'm so proud of you. You're such a workhorse and such a talent when it comes to your writing. I'd love to hear what you felt like your biggest challenge was when you were going through your writing and research process.
One of the biggest issues is that, for a lot of the specific areas that I focus on, and I touch on this in both in my introduction and my conclusion, is that Black women are very neglected in scholarly research. They're very neglected in journalistic research. And so finding finding sources and finding literature on these specific issues that I was looking into was incredibly difficult. And often I'd find that I would find a really good source and I would check the bibliography and it would send me in somewhat of a circle. And so you have this kind of, I hate to say incestuous, but it's similar to that cycle of these researchers who often, Dr. Deborah White, and Dr. Stevenson, who are often citing each other. And so just kind of go in a roundabout way, citing the same works, the same people. And that was a major issue. It was part of the reason why I focused so heavily on primary narratives throughout the thesis, was to supplement for the lack of academic research that I was able to find. And so a lot of the analysis that's included in the thesis is my own, because I really had no other options if I wanted to continue and persist with this topic and this project, and I so desperately wanted to. So I would say that I looked at probably over 200 narratives with the Federal Writers Project and all those slave narratives that I analyzed, which are usually very short considering that they were conducted with people that were rather elderly in the 1920s to the 40s, and alongside different people's autobiographies. Louisa Piquet, the author of 12 Years a Slave. Yeah, and so that was probably my biggest challenge, the biggest obstacle for me in writing this thesis, was just finding the literature, finding the research on Black women.
So to follow up on that then, where do you fit into that in terms of the direction of this passion, and where do you want to take this moving forward?
It actually inspired me to change my major. I was originally studying political science. I'll now be majoring in psychology and minoring in sociology so that I can continue to have a focus in social psychology as I continue with grad school and hopefully elevate my career in social psychology.
You started off at the beginning of your thesis saying that you had the goal of giving voice and agency to Black women. And I just have to say that your voice is so strong and your analysis is so rich. And I'm just really, really proud of you. Towards the end, I didn't write down your exact quote, but you said something about Black women being socialized to respond to the vulnerability of white women. And I want to dig into that a little bit and maybe even make it a little bit broader, because right now we're having conversations about whether or not we can have discussions on race in the classroom, because people want to protect the vulnerability of white people in the classroom and in those spaces. And so I'd just like to hear kind of a little bit of an expansion on that, and maybe how as educators we can, respond to that.
So a big point of my concluding chapter was education. And I decided to go in that direction for a couple of reasons. One of the major things that people are always saying is, be an activist, invest in activism. Black women have historically been directors and architects of activism. That is not a valid critique of Black women nor the Black community. But investing in education is so incredibly important, especially because I hit on the point of racial socialization. But the tie into that is you have to counter it with exposure in the school system. Because if they're not getting it at home, and they're not getting it within their communities, and they're certainly not getting positive imagery of other ethnic groups on the television screen, they're not getting it through the media, then they have to be exposed to other people, other forms of life, other ways of life, by their educators and by their teachers. And it's such a hefty responsibility and job to put on educators. But educators are truly, they form our society. Everything begins in childhood development. Everything begins in adolescence. If we don't shift those perspectives early on, they begin to solidify, and it's so hard to counter and challenge them as they grow older. And so one of the articles I read was actually White Women Tears by Matwa Akapati. And she discusses, I don't know if you're familiar with the sociological phenomenon of white women tears, how that's influenced how we, interact with other people and deal with conflict, especially in, educational or workplace settings. But if we don't value everyone's voices equally, and so as women, we are inherently on a second tier power level structure. Even without the additions of race and class and education level and all of these other factors. And so by weaponizing things that the patriarchy finds uncomfortable, such as forms of emotion, they are able to more successfully manipulate their social positioning, their power structure. We have to remove not the emotion from classrooms and from discussions. I think that that's a really important component. I think that passion and emotion is what is going to be the tool that changes our society. But I do think that that tool has to be utilized with consideration. And I think that we don't need to remove emotion. We need to become comfortable with uncomfortability.
Yes. So, I mean, I could ask a million more questions, but I think I want to let others jump in there. Yeah, just fabulous job.
Audience questions.
Mr. Gills.
You mentioned Audre Lorde at the beginning of this, prolific social critic, also prolific creative writer. Not many folks know that you, in addition to completing this thesis, simultaneously completed your creative thesis in creative writing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those two projects may influence each other and how they played off of each other.
So interestingly, the direction that I ended up taking my creative process was one of the original topic ideas that I considered for my thesis, which was comparative mythology. I ended up actually utilizing comparative mythology, or at least the field of it, the study of it, somewhat within my fourth chapter when I dealt with religion. Looking at the ways that religious syncretism has shaped Black American religiosity. Well, in my creative thesis, it is a story centered around a Creole American young affluent girl who is going through different phases of her life, and it's told through prose and a combination of structured storytelling. And so I think that the two, in some ways, especially as I got into my fourth chapter, really kind of fed into each other, because I was fueling them with the same fire, but they were different shades, if that makes sense. They were going to different places. And so the way that they kind of interact with each other is that you have my different energies funneled into these two projects, and both of which I really just invested so much of myself in. So yeah, the kind of avenue, the pathway that connects the two is obviously the inclusion of religion and race, but also that original comparative mythology tie-in. Sarah.
So I loved your thesis. It was really great. And you talk about Black faith and then the destructiveness of whiteness. So what role did you find that like white faith had in disenfranchising Black people?
So I mentioned this briefly in the presentation. When I get into the process by which Black Americans adopted white faith, it was a long, contentious process, I will say that. And it began within the 18th century, within the 1700s, when proselytizers were going across the South and converting enslaved peoples in droves. There's a really interesting autobiographical account by about S.J. Mary, it was actually authored by her husband and her son. But within it, you see kind of the adoption of the Christian faith and how that influences her throughout her life. And she adopts kind of a very complicated view of her surrounding community. And so I really get into the whole community aspect a lot more in my first chapter, where I'm dealing with the role of community in the lives of enslaved women. Because I don't know if you're familiar with the term kinship ties, but kinship ties have historically been one of the building blocks of Black American enslaved communities. And so fictive kinship ties or blood kinship ties both have a really, really important kind of connection with Black women and with Black communities. And that did not disappear with the presence of white American Christianity, but it certainly altered. One aspect of that community and that the community values was the presence of conjure, usually some kind of conjure doctor. They went by a plethora of names. One of them was that I found really interesting was, I want to say it was like the two-head snake doctors, and I thought that was so cool. But those doctors have played a really, really big role in uniting the community in hope, in faith, in agency, and giving them power, connecting them with their ancestors in the supernatural. And so with the presence of American Christianity, you saw the evolution, like I mentioned, with the religious syncretism. So our religious syncretism took place in a really different fashion than that occurred in like Jamaica or the Dominican Republic, where they were able to maintain their orishas and their gods. Because of the widespread, and like black people were not a monolith when they were forced to this country. They came from one general region, but a lot of different cultures. And so over time, those melded into each other, and we saw the combination of African tradition that was passed down, what remained from that, that combined with the slave culture that developed. And so what happens with the adoption of white American Christianity is you kind of have the slow erosion of that first culture that developed around the African ancestral traditions and religions. And so you have this thing that occurs, and it's still happening today. I mean, I mentioned this briefly, but these alternate forms of religion, these traditional African religions, have not disappeared. What we consider supernatural, they haven't vanished. They've become there's a public side, and then there's a secret side. And the more covert form of faith and worship is the occult. And the more public form is usually Black American Christianity. And so what you really have is the division of these two religiosities, which are indivisible. Maya.
So you mentioned like the sexualization of young Black girls. Where does this come from? Is it like the fetishization of people of like a different race? Is it due to them being like having to be subjugated to sexual violence and then the blame being laid on them? Where does it start?
So it starts with the way that power interacts with people in their minds is like, it's a really common saying that power is very corruptible. And I truly believe that if you believe yourself to be above other people, then that begins to influence all of your decisions. And so with the initial colonization of Africa and the kidnapping and trafficking of all of those people, I mean, you have these people who are at first, and this is what I meant by judging historical events by our modern convictions, because morality does not shift with time. Morality is morality no matter which age it's applied in. And that's something that has to be considered when you analyze things sociohistorically. You have to consider the constrictions of that time period. But if you have even one human being during that time period who says, this is wrong, you cannot argue that the historical setting does not allow for that kind of mindset. And so what you have is this legacy that we have of sexualizing Black girls, of mutilating and violating Black girls. And it's continued, and it's rooted in that original colonization. It's rooted in entitlement, and it's rooted in power. And so this began, like I said, on slave ships, but it really began on land. It began with word of mouth, an agreement to go to the sub-Saharan Africa and to go to West Africa and to kidnap these individuals and to impregnate slave women on slave ships and to allow them and watch them as they disintegrate as human beings. This is where it came from. It came from entitlement. And that entitlement still exists today. That entitlement is why we have to have BuzzFeed articles and superficial discussions on why don't Black women want you to touch their hair? And why is it odd that why did this woman get offended because I was staring at her on the train, or because I subtly shifted away from her? It's because of the entitlement of Black bodies. And that's something that's continued. And specifically the sexualization of young girls is because Black girls have historically been sexually abused at very, very early ages. I mentioned the fancy girl trade started as young as 9. That's not an anomaly. That is something that was routinely occurring. Something that I mentioned actually in an explanatory footnote is that currently, like contemporarily as we speak, one of the things that factors into people viewing Black girls as more adult is that biologically they typically manifest their menstrual cycles much earlier and begin puberty at around a rate of 2 to 1.5 years earlier than their white counterparts. And while there is no set biological explanation, I do theorize that this is because historically we have at least 3 centuries of Black girls being sexually violated and forced to bear children at exceptionally early ages from 8 to 12. There is no explanation in which young girls should be forced into sexual contact, be engaging in sexual contact, be bearing children at ages before they reach the age of maturity, before they reach the age of consent. These things have had a biological consequence on Black American girls and Black American bodies over the course of all these years. And so now we have this society that doesn't know how to deal with Black women with voices, where so long they've attempted to take them away. Yes.
You mentioned, or I think it was Prim who mentioned Lizzo, Megan Thee Stallion. Are there circles, communities? I can think of individual authors and influencers. Sonia Renee Taylor comes to mind. Are there circles where Black women are reclaiming, celebrating, reframing embodiment? The term Black girl magic that was popular, for several years. It has been popular for several years. Did you come across any of this in your research?
Yes,
joy,
actually.
Embodiment, and pleasure are the operative.
Yes. So there's a lot of different phrases: Black girl magic, Black girl joy, and it's become really, really popular since like the 90s. Before something that I briefly discussed called the pornification of rap, where Black female rappers were using their platforms to amplify Black female voices to spread positive messaging about Black girls and Black women. And so you have this really, really powerful thing happening where we begin to see a shift in how Black girls view themselves, how Black girls treat each other. And that's really, really important. Like I mentioned, with the internalization of certain negative behaviors and negative thoughts, negative traits, with the elimination of those, if there is enough shared love within the community, it can counter the degradation coming from the outside society. But there has to first be unification in order for that to occur. And so with Black Girl Magic and other similar themes happening, you kind of see Black girls beginning to embrace their Blackness and embrace their girlhood in a way that they were not previously allowed to, and that's been frowned upon. And this was actually a section of my thesis that I had to cut, where I specifically talk about the impact of demonizing Black beauty and like Black culture on Black girls. But it's had an incredibly negative effect, especially within the last century, where we see something called respectability politics begin to rise, and that's what I mentioned when I meant when I mentioned defendability and Black women living in defense of stereotype. And so, if you are constantly subscribing to respectability politics and disowning your culture and attempting to put distance between yourself and it, so that you are viewed as more respectable in society, so that you can navigate higher circles or different circles from those which you might naturally occupy, then you are inherently internalizing hatred. But the issue is with this Black girl magic and Black girl joy trend, because unfortunately we live in a society, we live in a society of media. Nothing comes without its backlash and downsides. The issue with the uplifting of Black female voices, with the promotion of Black girl magic, is that Black girl magic has been appropriated. That Black girl magic is being shared amongst people who are not Black girls. And so you have these things rising, especially in influencer culture and in reality TV star culture, where traits and cultural traditions that are shunned by Black women just trying to survive and navigate their lives, that are disregarded and discussed overall American society and most of the Western world, are now being embraced and viewed as the beauty standard on these non-Black fair-skinned women.
I guess kind of like going off of his question, like there was like this like one like NPR podcast that like I was listening to while driving about like how a lot of like our modern vernacular has like come from like African American English, and how it's stuff that like we used to like just acknowledge, but now it's basically just become part of like our language. What are some like very good examples of like culture that we see like everywhere today that might have like began with Black women that we just take for granted?
I think it's more than you know. It's more than the NPR article might have suggested. So in my first chapter, I actually have a linguistic theory that I discuss that studies specifically the South, because you can't, even if you don't regard people as people, that doesn't disregard people's influence on each other. And so the way culture and language develops is that it feeds off of those that are nearest to each other. So we have certain words like okra that come from Baktu, which is an ancient African language. It has a modern version now. But you see these different waves of linguism. And so most of our Southern vernacular has been informed by African American English or African American original language that migrated with them from Africa, because language doesn't disappear, it doesn't disintegrate, it merges. And so what I make an argument originally that what occurs within the first two generations of enslaved people and their existence within specifically the southern region, where they become really, really largely like populated and concentrated, is that a pidgin develops between American or British colonial English that's forming outside of like post-independence, and with the form of English that African Americans speak that is really deeply intertwined with their ancestral roots, with their ancestral languages. Because what occurred was Black Americans were abused for maintaining their cultural traditions and practices, especially their languages, because it was viewed as a form of rebellion and as a way to prove that they were attempting to escape. And so certain words that could pass for English became very commonly used in their everyday language. And that's kind of where we get our modern version of Southern English. And there's a couple of different theories about this. Most agree that there was some influence on one or the other, and that over the course of different years, especially one of the common arguments is that during the Great Migration that occurred, that died off. But again, things can change in a generation or two, but you have certain things that have like indisputably persisted, like the word okra, like the names of some of our musical instruments, like the traditions that we have at weddings in the South. And so because of the way that linguism works, it has had a very reciprocal relationship on each other. But if you're talking about the popularization of AAVE today, that has a lot to do with the popularization of social media. Black women are the architects of activism, but Black people have been very influential in pop culture since the 80s and 90s. And so Black people are usually valued for their abilities, if not their intellect. And that means that they are valued for their ability and their athletic ability and their fashion sense. Even if it's demonized at the time, it usually comes into popularity within a couple decades. And so this is what happened with African American vernacular English. What was originally demonized as ghetto or trashy or classless has become teenage slang speak. And that's kind of the narrative that's happened around that. And you see that evolution. And it goes back to the same thing, which is appropriation. It is not a natural cultural amalgamation like you see with the form of English that we speak in the South. It is a direct appropriation from Black American culture.
There's a lot that I'm not aware of that I feel like is appropriated, that like language that I use every day, probably.
It's really common, but I wouldn't take any personal accountability for it unless it's something that you're actively doing. And just do the research and try to better inform yourself. Life is all about trying to better inform yourself and make better decisions.
Committee, let's come up for a quick photo op, family after them.
Title slide.
I'm glad she went last because I don't know if
We could handle. That was so good. So good. Use the clicker. There you are.
What are you?
We gotta get our pictures in, I'm at 2%.
Uh-oh.
right.
I got.
Two on one side, two on the other. Here we go. There we go.
Veronica, over
Wait, do you want it on questions or do you want it on title?
here. Title.
Oh, what happened?
Yeah, maybe that was weird.
There we go.
Okay, so over here and then over there.
She got stolen.
Okay, we got this.
Thomas has to stand next to the.
Well, I
stand.
stand by the podium.
Y'all gotta scoot in a little bit because there's too much light coming in from the window.
Okay, we
All
have
right,
this.
yes, look at me. One, look at me. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Wait.
I'm so proud of you.
I know, man, you
Try to
should
keep
be
it
amazing, amazing. That's fantastic. That was awesome.
Yeah, I haven't had fun.
Okay.
I mean,
I need to know this, so.
You were so well informed. That was like most like in-depth presentation I have heard.
and then
A lot of like, yeah, your paper was 150 pages.
Hey, let's get the camera.
Can we get a family picture? I have 1% left. Gotta get it in.
You want up here? Okay. Hold on. Everyone gather around.
Come on, babe.
All right.
Wait, sorry.
1, 2.
Oh.
Yay.
Oh, what?
Oh, I'm sorry.
there you go.
You can take, why don't you take his phone and.
I have a phone too if you want to
Save this.
take it.
Do you,
You may have a phone, yeah, there we go. Thank you. All right.
Alright. 1, 2, 3. Make it one vertically. And can I get one?